Hey guys, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about something that's not really on the topic of cuisine, but it is a very Western thing, and it's something that we all seem to enjoy: beer. A simple word that means a lot, that's for sure. We've everybody who's listening to this has enjoyed a beer one time or another. It's a very popular beverage in Korea, and Korean beers are nice lagers. They're very nice beers. Being that style of like Budweiser, Eastern European Pilsner, little light costs and height and things. But now you can get IPAs and you can get a lot of these home brewed, Korean brewed beers that are very craft orientated. Very nice beers too, but nothing wrong on a hot summer day slamming down a height or a Koss or those type of beers. I like OB myself when it comes to the local types of beer. And we're going to have a little discussion on beer today. The Alula recipe here is from ancient Ur. Let me bring out my cursor here. This script is called cuneiform. It's done in little triangles. I know it looks hard to see as a language, but it is one of the oldest written languages in the world. And the Alula beer recipe is a recipe for the best beer around 2050 BC. From the Sumerian city of Ur in ancient Iraq. Now, the Sumerians themselves are a very advanced culture, and the city of Ur was extremely large. So it's no surprise that these people had a written language. But look at the age of this, right? That's a long time ago. 2000 BC, it's 5,000 years ago. Right? Beer is one of the world's oldest beverages, with the history of beer dating back to the 6th millennia BC. Right? The earliest Sumerian writings contain references to beer, not just recipes or anything like that, but there's a lot of talk about beer making, beer selling, beer buying, laws about beer. Hammurabi's Code stated that if beer is watered down, you could lose your life. So beer was very important to these people. A prayer to the goddess Nicasia, known as the hymn to Nicosia, serves as both as a prayer as well as a method of remembering a recipe for beer in a culture with a few literate people. Not everybody could read cuneiform, and it's a very difficult language to read. Even the scholars with computers today have a hard time doing it. But for people to remember a recipe, it was used as a prayer to the goddess of beer. So I thought that was very interesting. The invention of bread and beer has been said to be responsible for humanity's ability to develop technology and to build civilization. On a side note, what does it take to make beer? Or what does it take to make? Let's talk about makgeolli for a second. How do you make makgeolli? You have rice, narup, water, and off you go. But what kind of rice do you have? Short rice, long rice, that doesn't matter. What you have to make beer or makgeolli or anything else like that, you have to have extra. You have to fill your stomach first with food. To make beer or to make makgeolli you'd have to have extra food items to do that. Now, there's a lot of debate about which came first, beer or bread. And right now, I'm pretty sure that beer came first and bread is the second leftover from beer production. Which is interesting because, once again, growing up in the West, we always said bread was the staff of life, the building block of civilization. But it might have been beer, that's for sure. The developed technologies, once again, once they start figuring out how this stuff works, how to make it better, that's developing a technology, a very modern technology. Today, the brewing industry is a global business consisting of several dominant multinational companies and many thousands of smaller producers ranging from pub brews to regional breweries. Now in Korea, in Busan and in Seoul, almost every city now are little brew pubs. They're making their own beer and selling their own beer locally. This is a fairly new thing. I'm sure you guys have seen a few because I know there's a couple in Dongdae right now, and Sachik Stadium, there's quite a few there right now. These little brew pubs. It's very hard. That's a hard thing to do, but once again, you have to make a good beer consistently. It's fairly expensive to start up a brew pub. Regional breweries, the IPAs here. There's the Monk IPA that's brewed in Gyeongsan, Namdo. Exactly what city, I'm not sure, but it's a regional beer that's made here, down here, which is not sold up into Seoul. More than 223 billion liters are sold per year, producing global revenues of about 459.5 billion US dollars in 2019. It's extremely large. These numbers are coming from the large companies. These are the brew pubs or any of the smaller places, maybe not even the regional ones. This is we are talking Budweiser, Cass, and Haidt, and Heineken. So they're all the big ones. This was a funerary. This was found in an Egyptian tomb, and there's two things going on here for the afterlife: the bakery and the brewery. A funerary model of a bakery and a brewery from the 11th dynasty in Egypt, 2000 BC. So in 2000 BC, it was considered so important, these two items, that they would send this off with their loved ones when they passed away, so in the afterlife they could have beer and bread. We don't think the Egyptians is as much as alcohol producers or consumers, but if you study history and you look back at it, they produce an awful lot of alcohol. They are big wine producers, big beer producers, and even today now they are looking into the funerary urns. When they buried the pharaohs, they realize it's beer residue that's in there, and they're cultivating those ancient yeasts, trying to come back with through DNA and all that other stuff, trying to figure out how to make these ancient brews. And that's what they're called, ancient brews. And if you typed it in on the internet, you'll find tons and tons of recipes and equipment and where to get the yeast from these, but all over the world, these ancient recipes and ancient yeast is apparently a very important thing. Medieval Europe, the beginning of beer as we know it. Almost any cereal containing a certain sugar can undergo spontaneous fermentation due to the wild yeast in the air. I know there's probably a lot of new words here. Cereal. You're not talking cornflakes. Cereal, any kind of wheat, barley, rice, corn, millet, humney, buckwheat. I can't think of the buckwheat name right now. I'm trying to think of that. Anything that grows, anything a starchy rice type of white rice or wheat type of grain is a cereal. And they do contain a certain amount of sugars, natural sugars and starches. They will automatically, spontaneously ferment. And obviously you know the word fermentation because obviously kimchi ferments. You're familiar with that word. But spontaneous means to do it naturally. Because in the air is wild yeast, and the wild yeast is what the Egyptians used. They're finding out that there's so many different varieties of yeast used in Egyptian brewery that they assume that really it was not added but was just in the air. And once again, a lot of these prayers have a lot to do with wishing it would ferment. So it's kind of interesting that way. Beer was one of the most common drinks during the Middle Ages. It was consumed daily. It was drunk daily by all social classes in northern and eastern parts of Europe, where grape cultivation was difficult or impossible. what made beer the healthy thing, why people were drinking, is that at one point you had to boil it. Now, when you do wine, you don't boil the wine, but you're not using water to make it. And in southern Italy, you can grow grapes very easily. Northern Europe, Germany, you can't grow grapes that easily. I mean, today, of course, they can because of modern technology, but like in the Middle Ages, grapes are always on the Mediterranean area. And so you can squeeze the grapes, let the natural yeast in the air ferment it, and you have wine, a low-grade wine, a low-alcohol wine. With beer, we'll talk more about beer production, but you have to do is malt the barley, grow the barley, and then boil that. Boiling that obviously would kill all the bacteria in the water. The medieval beers were very low alcohol, too. They weren't as high as what we drink, the 4.5, 5, and 6 today. They were more like what we call near beers, 2.2, well, like light beers, that's for sure. The use of hops in beer was written of in 822 AD by Carolingian abbot. Flavoring beer with hops was known at least since the 19th century. Now, hops do two things. They flavor beer, and if you ever have an IPA, there's a lot of hops in there. But the reason why they were using hops, too, is a natural preservative. So they would put hops into the beer, and it would preserve it naturally. I know there's a lot of new vocabulary in this, and actually I didn't realize that when I was writing this, I didn't realize a lot of this was new to you. And I should have, once again, hops is a type of plant that's used in beer, and that's what makes beer a little bitter. And if you have an IPA, that's what they call a hoppy beer that has a very strong hops. I personally like a lot of hops in my beer. I like IPAs. And it's called IPA, stands for India Pale Ale, IPA. And what that was beer was being brewed in England and shipped to India. And if they had to put extra hops in it to preserve it from going bad on the long sea voyage. So that's where the amount of hops was put in there. 822 AD. This might not mean anything to you, but 800 AD, Carolingians were the first kings of France. So this is kind of interesting because when you think about France, you think about wine. You don't think about beer. In 800 AD, this 22 years after the founding of what we call modern France today. France has been in almost the same shape since 800 AD. France has never really changed shape, culturally intact. An abbot is a monk, but a head monk, a synonym, but one that's in charge. So there's a lot of new information here and the idea of this, but the idea is that hops are used at this time, once again, by religious people. And we talk a lot about winemaking, and wine production was in charge by the church because the church needed wine for their ceremonies. And so it was very important for them to produce wine. Now, beer was not used for that. And I said, like before, to make alcohol, you had to have extra. So the church was very wealthy at that time. It still is. And they were the ones that had basically the science of going on. Now they used hops for flavoring, but they realized that it was a preservative. And as beer making went on and more, hops were beginning to understand antiseptic qualities. Antiseptic means killing bacteria. Early modern Europe. In Europe, beer largely remained a homemaker's activity and was made in the home during medieval times. So every housewife knew how to make beer. It was like nothing magic about it. Everybody knew how to make it. The oldest and still operating commercial brewery is in Westfalen in Bavaria. Bavaria is in Germany, and it's an abbey, and has been a brewery since 1040, and it's still open today. So it's kind of interesting that once again we talk. An abbey is a religious institution. Bavaria is part of Germany today. Germany that we know today was really only started in the 1880s. Germany is actually a very new country. Isn't that a history lesson? Really. But by the 14th and 15th century, beer making was gradually changed from family-oriented activity to an artisan one, with pubs and monasteries brewing their own beer for mass consumption. So in the 14th, 15th century, this started to become a business, basically, is what this was talking about. Yeah, families still made it and things like that, but now it's starting to be brewed outside the house and being sold, and pubs started to become a reality. Monasteries are where monks live. And once again, beer consumption had a lot to do with health benefits because it's boiled water. And you guys know boiled water is much safer than regular water. So they started brewing their own beer for mass consumption. So they started selling it. Once again, they realized that is a good business that way. That's for sure. Following significant improvements in the efficiency of the steam engine in 1765, industrialization of beer became a reality. The steam engine, you cannot say enough about how that has changed the world. When it came to the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine made the possibility of not only transporting beer by train, but in producing beer, bottling beer, sanitizing, boiling beer, things like that. It was amazing what the steam engine did for food and cultures. The introduction of the thermometer in 1760, and which allowed breweries to increase the efficiency. The thermometer itself was another world changing, and a lot of these changes came around to make beer more efficient. When to start the boiling, when to stop the boiling, what temperatures you bring it to, things like that. Especially in fermentation, is very delicate. If you do wines or anything like that, if you make any homemade alcohol, if you make homemade makgeolli without a thermometer, you're just guessing. So it's very important. Prior to the late 18th century, malt was primarily dried over fires made from wood, charcoal, or straw. And after 1600, from coke, which is a natural charcoal. This charcoal is made from wood. This is what they get from the ground. And it's probably a horrible flavor because they did the same thing with whiskeys. Instead of using wood or anything natural, they started using oil and gas to do the malt. Now, we didn't talk really about malt. Lightly talked about malt. What you do is you take barley and you soak it in water. When it starts growing, that's the malting. If you make shike, it's the same method as making shike. It's just done with barley. Beer and whiskey have the same life. They start off the same way. As with beer, you get whiskey. To make whiskey, you malt barley, and then you dry it. After you dry it, you boil it with water. That is the malt. Whiskey and beer start the same way. Beer is not aged. Whiskey is aged. Beer has natural carbonation. Whiskey is distilled. So once again, there's a lot of differences, but really they do begin the same way. This is elitist consumption. Who drinks the most? You guys a little light there. Korea's a little lighter color. Russians, they're not beer drinkers. Let's get to Germany. Obviously, Germany. When you talk Germany, you talk beers. That's why Spain was fairly dark. Australia, no surprise there. America, no surprise. But I thought Canada would be dark. Because Canadians seem to like their beer, and they make very nice beer too. They've always made very good beers. I don't know why, like Central America, South America, there's no information. Well, these are Islamic countries here, so their beer consumption would be very, very low, if at all. British colonies at one time. I thought India would have, because India does make some nice beer. Thailand makes, Tiger beer. There's a lot of things missing, and obviously China itself should be on this map. Once again, sometimes it's hard to get accurate information, but it does give an idea of Northern European descent is where most of the beer consumption was made, where it was founded, and then obviously English-speaking colonies. These are English, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Ghana. These were all one time Canada, America, United States. They were all British colonies at one time, so it wouldn't be no surprise that they would drink beer. In the modern beer business, right, because the things have changed a lot, advances in refrigeration, international and transcontinental shipping, marketing, and commerce have resulted in an international marketplace where a consumer has literally hundreds of choices of beer between various styles of local, regional, national, and foreign beers. There's a chain called Wabar. I don't know if it's in Busan because it's up in Seoul, and they have maybe 120 types of beers. So and it's a lot of fun to go to. Once again, in Korea, you got 6 or 7 major breweries making 6 or 7 types of beer. Not just height and cost, but there's a lot more out in OB. But those are the big 3 ones. But these little regional breweries are becoming bigger and bigger. It's a market that's growing quite well, much faster than wine, that's for sure. And the reason for that too is people have a little more money. This is just a very quick way of we talk about beer making. Okay, the mash, the boil, fermentation, and containment. Right? Water to grains creates what's called the wort. Right, so you have the barley that's malted. You mix that with water, and that's called wort. Then you have partial grains. A lot of Korean beers are made with rice. Budweiser is a partial grain. It's made mostly with rice as an adjunct grain. German purity law is beer can only be made of 4 items: yeast, barley, water, and I'm sorry, Leon's banging on the door. And hops. So the Korean the German purity law is like 15 something is that you can only have those 4 items. Most of the world can make it up. Rice, corn is used a lot because any grain you can do it with. The next step would be the boil. Right, so you bring the wort to a boil. You extract the water to create the wort. You boil the wort and add other ingredients. Once again, if there's adjunct grains, hops, or that kind of thing, plus the partial grains extract that creates the wort. At that point, after it's boiled, you add these two together, and you go to the boil. After that, it's fermented. So this water is very clean from boiling. Then the yeast is added to the water, and it begins the fermentation process. This is where the thermometer is very important because then they can control the temperature of it. So there's a few more steps in here, but it's very simple. And at this point, the containment: keg beer, which you guys call live beer, sangmekju, right, or bottled beer. And usually, if they're going to put it in bottles, there is a certain heat process called pasteurization, which really kills off the bacteria, but it kills off the yeast too. And sometimes, so like the Germans say, "Oh, Leon, quiet." The Germans just say sometimes the American beers taste burnt because of the boiling process, how they sanitize the beer with temperature. And then you have refrigeration, which really changed everything. Right? It's just a schematic drawing that just shows a little easier. They take the grains here and they mill the grains, they mash it together, they boil it, they cool it, they ferment it, filter it. Conditioning would be what you consider hops. And a lot of times with modern beer, it's hop extract. It's not really, they don't throw the plant in there, they put some liquid in there. That gives it the flavor. Now they don't really need the preservative value of it anymore. They really just need something to give that beer that hoppy flavor. And then the packaging, whether it's back into kegs or into bottles. this is a schematic of the production that would you'd see at COS or anything like that. I'm not going to really go through it that much, but on the bottom here, really receiving the raw material, starch to sugar, sugar to alcohol, distillation. Once again, if they're going to do any kind of distillation to increase the alcohol, because beer alcohol is much higher than natural. If you made homemade beer, you're going to only end up with 1-2%, maybe 3% if you're happy. Beer is about 5.5% today, and a lot of times alcohol is added, or they use this whole method here to increase the alcohol content. And so this is business. This is how the big boys do it. All right, adjusting proof, aging alcohol, bottling the final product, and shipping. Right? Once again, in one place like this, you could do is corn, wheat or rye, malted barley. At this point here, you could make, actually to this point, right here, you can make beer or whiskey. You can make either at that point. And whiskey's aged in wood, so this part here would be, the warehouse part would be wood barrels. Beer, originally, Budweiser was originally aged in wood barrels. They do add wood chips to it to give it it's called Kreuzener. It's a process. I'm saying there's a lot more to beer production that's followed in this, or all this information. But once again, I just want to give you a review of beers. And this is a good little graph. It gives you the colors and the names. You got a stout, dark ale, golden ale, wheat beer, pilsner, and lager. Now, Korean beers, most of the Korean beers are in the lager family. They're very light beers. Pilsner and lagers are in the same family. Wheat beer is made with wheat and not barley, obviously. Once you get into the ale, though, you're using a different and stout. You're using a different yeast. When you're fermenting ales, the yeast lives on top, and when you ferment the rest of them, the yeast lives on the bottom. It's a different yeast. It's a different creature. It has a different flavor. So that's where the difference comes from. Right? Most beer falls into roughly time and temperature, and the variety of yeast is used during fermentation. Once again, there's a lot of varieties out there, and they're even finding more and more, from natural out there to the Egyptian, the Eastern European, Poland. They find a lot out that area. So it's broken into two classifications: top fermented beers, ale, stout, and wheat beers, and then bottom fermented beers, pale lagers, Bock beer, Oktoberfest beer, pilsners, and steam beers. Steam beers, once again, we talked a little about steam engine and steam. Once they had perfected steam engines and stuff like that, steam beers are more of a cooked type of beer. Korea, you don't really get too many of them, but in East Coast and West Coast America, California, there's a lot of Anchor steam beers. There's a lot of, it seems to be a real popular brand in the California coast. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you learned something. It was just a brief talk. I didn't want to go into it too much because there is an awful lot to it. But I think you should pick up some pointers on here about ales and lagers and pilsners and Bock. There's so many types out there, and it is not a hard thing to make. It just takes some certain types of raw material. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you later.